Hi, I'm Kathleen Tate, and I am retired and sitting on the board of the Center for Reproductive Rights. So happy to be here today to read from a chapter of Let It Shine, this lovely book, Stories of Black Women Freedom Fighters. And I have the chapter for Ella Josephine Baker. She was born in Norfolk, Virginia, December 17th, 1903, and died in New York City, December 13th, 1986. Her quote is, "Sit-ins and other demonstrations are concerned with something much bigger than a hamburger or even a giant-sized Coke." As a little girl, Ella Baker was blessed with sass, smarts, and a whole lot of strength. Ella came from a family of determined people. When slavery was abolished, Ella's grandfather, Ross, who had been enslaved, saved enough money to buy himself several acres of land. This was land he'd slaved on for years before freedom came. Ross was a proud, defiant minister who spoke out against prejudice. His wife, Josephine Elizabeth, after whom Ella was named, also held her head high in the face of indignity. When Josephine had been enslaved, her mistress chose a husband for her. Some man she didn't truly love. Josephine wanted to marry Ross, and against her mistress's wishes, she did. Ella's grandparents loved to share these stories of courage with Ella. Some say Ella got her sassy spirit and her strength from Josephine and Ross. This is the illustration, which I think is really lovely. As a child, Ella lived on a small farm in Littleton, North Carolina, with her mother, Georgiana, her younger sister, Margaret, and Curtis, her older brother. Their neighbors, Black folks mostly, who farmed land. Sometimes dry days or pesky bugs made the crops measly, and there were seasons when fruits and vegetables were scarce. But sharing was the natural way of things in Littleton. Georgiana showed her children that there was humility in freely giving of what you had. The Bakers were often graced with a healthy garden, and no shame in asking openly for what you needed. She also told her children not to settle for anything less than the best. Littleton followed Jim Crow laws to the letter. Like most Southern towns back in the early 1900s, Littleton posted signs that spelled out Jim Crow rules for using water fountains, public restrooms, hotels, and restaurants. The sign said whites only and coloreds. Young Ella observed segregation laws, but she never let them make her feel inferior. She knew deep down that Jim Crow was a bunch of hogwash. When Ella, Margaret, and Curtis attended Littleton's colored grade school, Georgiana took one look at their tattered lesson books and saw that her children weren't getting proper schooling. So with money Ella's father had saved, Georgiana sent her children to a better school. During most of Ella's childhood, her father, Blake, worked as a waiter on a ferry boat that sailed between Norfolk, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. He missed his family terribly, but the money he earned was enough to send all three of his children to Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. A private high school and college rolled into one. Ella registered for Shaw in 1918, not long before she turned 15 years old. She completed high school and college at the university, and boy, did that girl ever study. Shaw was Ella's chance to put her smarts to the test, a test she took on with poise. Ella loved science, and when grading time came around, her report card was full of A's, including in biology and chemistry. Yeah, Ella did right by her daddy's tuition money. But there was one thing about Shaw that didn't sit right with her. Shaw was a Baptist school, and the university was big on rules. One rule was that young men and women couldn't walk together on the university grounds. Ella thought this rule was hooey. Other students felt the same way. But unlike the Jim Crow laws she had grown up with, the school rules that bothered her were something Ella could fight. Ella rallied her fellow students, and together they wrote a letter to Shaw officials asking them to do away with the rule. Then she got the boldness of thunder in her and went with Shaw authorities face to face. She spoke on behalf of herself and her classmates, calmly stating why they wanted the rule dropped. There wasn't much debate. The rule was removed and the students were free to stroll Shaw grounds with anyone they pleased. Ella didn't know it then, but she was taking her first steps toward becoming an activist. Ella graduated from Shaw in 1927 with hopes of becoming a medical missionary or a social worker. But she needed further schooling for both, expensive schooling that would cost more money. Money neither she nor her parents had. Ella was rich with desire, though. Working to make changes in Shaw's strict rule book sparked something in her. After graduation, she left North Carolina for New York City. New York was a boomtown for Black people in the 1930s. The Harlem Renaissance was in full swing. Black people were speaking up and out like never before. For Ella, New York represented a chance to use her college education and her Baker family resolve to help others. When Ella arrived in New York, she was immediately struck by the poverty she saw on the city's streets. This encouraged her to attend political meetings and rallies. She joined the Young Negroes Cooperative League, which is the YNCL, a group that organized cooperative grocery stores throughout the United States. She was also active with the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, a government program that provided jobs for unemployed laborers and artists. And she worked with several women's rights groups, such as the Women's Day Workers and Industrial League, a union for domestic employees. Ella also wrote articles for various newspapers, including the West Indian News and the National News. In 1935, Ella contributed to an investigative report that exposed the poor working conditions of Black domestic workers in New York City. The article was published in The Crisis, the magazine for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, whose headquarters were in New York City. In 1938, Ella took a job with the NAACP, where she could fight against racial injustice and fight to clip Jim Crow's wings once and for all. Her first job there was as an assistant field secretary. She traveled throughout the South for months at a time, explaining the NAACP's mission and recruiting new members. But Jim Crow was still alive and well in the South, and many Black folks weren't so eager to join any cause that would disgruntle white people. White people owned most of the businesses that kept the South going. They were the ones hiring, and they were also the ones who, at the snap of a finger, could fire any Black man or woman who they thought was becoming too outspoken. To make matters worse, the lynching of innocent Black people had become widespread in the South. Some accounts say nearly 3,000 Black people were lynched in the United States between the late 1800s and 1930s. Getting laws passed that would stop lynching was at the top of the NAACP's list. Many Southern Blacks saw the NAACP as a bunch of uppity Northerners. Many whites saw them as Black people who were overstepping their bounds. To Ella, the NAACP was hope for putting an end to the racial discrimination that plagued the nation and endangered the lives of Black people. But she had to work hard and sometimes talk fast to get her point across before some intolerant soul tried to shush her. Ella once said, "If you talk down to people, they can sense it. They can feel it, and they know whether you are talking with them or at them, or talking about them." She knew the best way to reach people was to speak to them as she would a friend. And she had an easygoing way about her that drew people in. She was far from uppity, and over time, she gained the trust of people who once had been doubters of the NAACP's importance. Thanks to Ella, the NAACP's membership grew. In 1942, the NAACP appointed Ella National Director of Branches. It was her job to manage all the local NAACP offices in the United States. The NAACP believed that to grow strong, it had to plant firm roots in the towns and cities that dotted the nation. Local NAACP offices, which spread from Tallahassee to Topeka to Pepperdine, were the seeds that set these roots spreading. Most branch offices were in Black neighborhoods. Ella helped each branch seek out new members, and she advised them on how to approach city officials when they wanted to improve things like housing conditions and hiring practices. Through Ella's efforts with the NAACP, Black people began to see that together they could make a change. And in 1954, when Ella became president of the NAACP New York City branch, that torch she had lit glowed even brighter. As branch president, Ella took a special interest in school segregation. Black people were dead tired of Jim Crow, yet he hovered over every schoolyard and classroom, preventing Black students and white students from learning under the same roof. During an NAACP visit to Alabama, Ella made a friend named Rosa Parks. Rosa was a member of the NAACP and the secretary of the Montgomery branch. She was the catalyst that launched the Montgomery, Alabama boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott was an important step in gaining equality for African Americans. The boycott ended segregation on buses in the state of Alabama. Ella helped sponsor several fundraising events that kept the boycotts going, but there were still more battles to win. To Ella and to many other Black people, there remained a long journey ahead, a journey that required even more of what Ella Baker did best: push people into action. Soon after the Montgomery bus boycott, civil rights crusader Martin Luther King called together the South's leading Black ministers to attend a meeting in Atlanta, Georgia on January 11th, 1957. With racial tensions building, the South was in a sorry state of hatred. On the eve of the meeting, several Montgomery churches were bombed. Dr. King went to Montgomery to comfort the sufferers, leaving Ella and his wife, Coretta Scott King, to coordinate the meeting in his absence. Civil rights activists Bayard Rustin and the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth worked with Ella and Coretta to pull the meeting together. The 60 ministers who gathered in Atlanta formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, a civil rights group made up of church congregations and freedom-fighting organizations throughout the South. Dr. King was president of the SCLC. He asked Ella to organize the SCLC's Crusade for Citizenship, a voter registration campaign that encouraged Black people to vote. Ella went right to work, planning 22 rallies in 22 Southern states, scheduled to happen on February 12, 1958. Organizing the rallies was only part of the job. To make the crusade a success, Ella had to convince Black people that voting was their right and the way to fight for change. The rallies took place as planned, but not many Black people registered to vote. Then on February 1st, 1960, 4 Black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, struck out against segregation by sitting at a Woolworth's lunch counter reserved for whites only. When the waitress refused to serve them, they sat. When people called them names and cursed them, they sat. When their backsides ached and their feet fell asleep, they sat. They stayed at that lunch counter all day long, sitting for freedom. Their quiet demonstration became known as the Greensboro Sit-in. The next day, more students came to Woolworth's to sit, and even more came after that. Soon, these sit-ins, top stories on the nightly news, spread through the South. The students endured all kinds of torment: hot coffee spilled on their heads, mustard squirted in their eyes, burning cigarettes pressed to their skin. But they didn't budge, and they held fast to their aim to protest without violence. Ella knew that the best way to make change happen was to get young people more involved in the civil rights movement. Young people were less concerned about the ways of whites. They had the courage it took to fuel the fire for justice. These sit-ins were a boost to the struggle for equality. But Ella believed the students needed guidance and organization to make their sit-ins truly effective. To help the students coordinate their efforts, Ella devised a gathering, the Student Leadership Conference in North Carolina at Shaw University, where she had received her diploma. Here's the illustration for that page, also quite lovely. The 3-day conference took place in April 1960, during Easter weekend. Nearly 300 students from all over the South came dressed in their best Easter bonnets and bow ties, ready to share their ideas. During the conference, they formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Ella became SNCC's chief advisor. The students lovingly called her Miss Ella and considered her their guardian angel. She established SNCC's main office in Atlanta and helped the group define their slogan, "We are all leaders." To keep the cause for equality pressing onward and to praise SNCC's mission, Ella wrote an article which was published in June 1960 for the Southern Patriot newspaper. She wrote, the Student Leadership Conference made it crystal clear that sit-ins and other demonstrations are concerned with something much bigger than a hamburger or even a giant-sized Coke. Negro and white students, North and South, are seeking to rid America of racial segregation and discrimination, not only at the lunch counters, but in every aspect of life. Ella Baker's unstoppable determination helped bring that fight for freedom alive. That's the end of my chapter. It was a real pleasure to share it with you. I am a big fan of this book. So many of the chapters are inspiring, and I encourage you to read them all.